Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel, Chapter 3, Subtle Change of Darkness. Yvette Kale watched as her husband reappeared. She could also tell that whatever he had experienced had an impact on him. When he was fully back, she ran over and hugged him. It took him a moment to hug her back, but she could tell he was thankful to be able to do it. She could even tell by his breathing that what he saw had scared him. Even from what Alexandra had read, it had scared her. She looked at him and said, "Richard, what did you see?" She held her husband as he said, "I saw him make his way through whatever that place was. I saw corpses walk as if it was perfectly natural. They were dead, but they walked. In fact, they did more than walk. They attacked. It didn't make any sense." She heard Alexandra get up and say, "Richard, are you saying the corpses actually walked?" She felt her husband nod, and she then heard Alexandra reply by saying, "This makes no sense at all." She then noticed that Alexandra's gaze was focused on the far wall. She then heard her ask, "Richard, what type of sword was it that Pius Augustus had?" She made her husband look at the sword that Alexandra had seen and said, "Richard, was that Pius Augustus's sword?" She let him walk over to it, as if he was studying it with great interest. After a bit, she saw him shake his head as he said, "No, Pius's gladius had struck the blue artifact, which I think was Julios, if I remember from the book your grandfather wrote, Alexandra. Julios was the ancient who could defeat Jaturga. The gladius I had seen glowed a bluish color. This one doesn't glow, which means it's not the same sword." She then saw Alexandra head over to a picture frame near the door and saw a chapter page hanging on the wall. She watched her take down the page. As that happened, she heard Alexandra say, "You might as well take it, Richard. If you run into more of those creatures, you will need it to protect yourself." Yvette then remembered one thing. She looked at Alexandra and said, "Wait, Alexandra. Richard brought something which he can use to defend himself. Richard, why don't you go get it?" She watched her husband head to the door and saw him say, "I'll go get it. Let's meet in the kitchen. I want to know how that plaque looks." She watched Richard run out the door, and she also hoped he'd be okay out there. She knew those things were out there, and she was sure that now her husband would see them. Richard Kale ran out the door and straight for his car. He knew what he had to get. He needed his sword. It was the same sword his father owned, as well as his grandfather. The sword was a family heirloom. He also wondered if his ancestors ever used the sword in the way he intended to use it. Yvette had talked him into bringing it with them, but he wasn't sure why. Now he was sure why, especially as he unlocked the trunk. He saw some of the creatures he saw when he followed Pius Augustus. Now he understood Yvette's urgency to get in the door. He started to wonder how many more creatures were out there, watching and waiting. He quickly opened the trunk and pulled out the case the sword was in. He didn't want to open the case and provoke an attack. With the case now in hand, he closed the trunk and almost jumped when a voice said, "Excuse me, sir." Richard looked straight at a man who wasn't standing there a moment before. He hadn't seen any other cars around, and looked at the man and cautiously said, "May I help you?" The man smiled, and Richard felt as if he looked at that smile before. "Inspector Legrasse, I'm investigating a murder that happened here. Do you mind answering a few questions?" Richard started to inwardly worry, but he wasn't about to let it show. He looked at the man and said, "I'm not sure I can answer any. I just arrived here today. Nothing else I can tell you." He watched as the man looked at him and said, "Are you a friend of Miss Roivas?" Richard nodded, but said nothing more as the man leaned closer and said, "I don't know why, but you look very familiar. Just be careful. Whoever killed Dr. Roivas may still be lurking about. Might even be out there watching us." He saw the man point out in the distance. He turned to look where the inspector pointed and saw more of the zombie-like creatures. He then said, "Are you suggesting that the murderer is out there, Inspector?" He turned to face the inspector, only to see no one there. He found that very unsettling. He started to wonder if the inspector had been all he seemed to be. With all the strange things they had discovered, he had a feeling that it was far from over. He decided it was time to get back inside, where it would be much safer. He ran in the door and headed right for the kitchen. When he got in there, he saw Yvette and Alexandra looking at the metal plate and saw a glowing red rune on it. He looked at them and said, "Do you see what I see?" When they nodded, he said quickly, "Draw that rune. I think that rune represents Pius's ancient. I'll do the same." He quickly drew the rune on a piece of paper. The second he was done, he felt the familiar feeling of fatigue that he associated with the blink. He shook his head and blinked his eyes until it passed. When it finally passed, he glanced at the plate again and was shocked. The symbol didn't match the one he just drew. As he looked, he felt an odd sense of awareness hit him. He had a feeling he knew what his blinks were. Alexandra looked at the shocked look that was on Richard's face. Whatever had just happened, she could tell he noticed something big. She turned to Yvette and said, "Any clue on what he noticed?" She watched as Yvette shook her head and said, "Whenever he blinks, it's hard to tell what shocks him. He always says things are different, but who knows what it is? However, he feels it is linked to that rune we drew." She looked at the blue rune, and then at the one she drew. She then looked at Yvette's and noticed that underneath Yvette's drawing, it looked like she had a second rune there. She looked at her and said, "Yvette, why do you have the original rune that was on the plate?" She watched as Yvette looked at it and said, "Because I still see the purple rune there. It's underlying the blue one, but it's there." She then heard Richard say, Now I understand my problem. Now I see it, and it is the second creepy thing that has happened. Look at the rune I drew. She watched as Richard held up the one that he drew, and she gasped. What he had drawn looked nothing like the one on the door. He then said, before my blink, that was on the door. I think there is more going on than meets the eye. I bet after my next attack, that image will be green to me. Alexandra watched as Yvette walked to the plate and said, that sword looks like the gladius. Maybe it's the key to the lock. She looked at the gladius she now held and realized Yvette was partially right. She smiled and said, you're half right, Yvette. I need to enchant it first somehow, like Richard said the other one was. However, I don't think that will be for a while yet. Besides, Yvette, you said there are still 2 runes there. All we need to do is somehow enchant the gladius to match one of those 2 runes, right? She watched as Richard shook his head and said, I don't know. It can't be that simple. If your grandfather had the enchanted gladius, it would be in here. However, it wasn't enchanted with the matching alignment, but the one that can beat it. Maybe the tome will have something in it. I don't think venturing outside would be best. Those creatures are starting to appear out there. Plus, I don't want to run into that inspector again. He gives me the creeps. She started to take them back to the library where she had left the tome and realized what Richard was talking about. She said as she walked, Richard, are you saying Inspector Legrasse was out there as well? Didn't he see those creatures? She heard Richard say, I think he knew they were there. He pointed right at them. Besides, there was something familiar in his smile, like I had seen it before. I just wish I knew where. As they entered the secret room, she heard Yvette say, it will come to you, hon. Right now, I think it's time to find out what the next chapter contains. Are you ready? She watched as Richard pulled a sword out of the box he was carrying and said, I'm ready. Where and when is this chapter taking place? Alexandra looked down at the page and said, looks like the year 1150 A.D. in the area of Angkor Thom region of Cambodia. Must be a hidden temple in the chapter. She was almost startled when Yvette said, my father mentioned of hidden temples in that area of the world. Maybe after all this you can tell him where it is. She watched as Richard looked at his wife and said, if Dr. Lindsay wants to search it, hon, I will tell him not to. I'm sure I'll be encountering more corpses. She watched as Richard then faced her and said, I'm ready to go, Alexandra. Start the chapter. She nodded and put the page into the book. She started with the chapter title, The Binding of the Corpse God, and watched as Richard's image soon appeared in the book. There was no doubt that whoever the chapter was about, Richard would be watching over them.